When Trump talked about using Bitcoin to pay off America's debt, most people heard a headline. What they missed was the signal buried underneath it. Because that comment didn't just reveal a misunderstanding of Bitcoin, it accidentally highlighted the exact type of digital asset the global financial system has been quietly preparing for. When Donald Trump floated the idea of using Bitcoin to help settle America's debt, it sounded bold, almost visionary. But once you strip away the headline and actually test the numbers, the entire idea collapses in seconds. The U.S. is staring at more than $35 trillion in debt. That number alone is difficult to process. So the question isn't whether Bitcoin is valuable, it's whether it can physically scale to absorb something that massive. Let's say the government somehow accumulated 1 million Bitcoin. That already sounds extreme, considering there will only ever be 21 million in existence. At current prices, that purchase alone would cost billions. But even then, it wouldn't matter. For that Bitcoin stash to cover the full debt, each individual coin would need to be worth tens of millions of dollars. Not thousands, not hundreds of thousands, tens of millions per coin. At that point, Bitcoin's total market value would exceed the combined wealth of every major economy on Earth. It would dwarf global stock markets, real estate, and even the total amount of cash in circulation worldwide. That's the moment the illusion breaks. Because this isn't about belief, hype, or long-term optimism. It's about math. And the math makes one thing painfully clear: Bitcoin was never designed to move debt at a global scale. And that realization forces an uncomfortable question. If Bitcoin can't realistically handle settlement at that level, what was this system actually supposed to look like? This is where most conversations about Bitcoin quietly stop. Supporters will say Bitcoin is scarce, decentralized, and unstoppable. All of that can be true at the same time and still miss the real problem. Scarcity doesn't automatically equal usability at a global scale. Bitcoin was designed to hold value, not to move massive amounts of it quickly. Every transaction competes for space, settlement slows under pressure, and costs rise when demand spikes. That structure works fine when people are holding, trading, or storing wealth. It breaks down when you ask it to act as a global settlement layer. That's the bottleneck no one likes to talk about. If Bitcoin were suddenly required to handle trillions in daily transfers, the network would choke. Fees would surge. Settlement times would stretch. And liquidity would become fragmented instead of fluid. This is why the idea of Bitcoin replacing the existing financial rails doesn't hold up under scrutiny. It was never meant to replace banks, payment networks, or clearing systems. It was meant to sit alongside them as digital gold. And that distinction matters. Because once you separate holding value from moving value, you realize the world doesn't need one asset to do everything. It needs different tools for different jobs. Bitcoin fills one role extremely well, but settlement at a planetary scale requires something else entirely. And once you see that difference, a new question emerges. If Bitcoin was never built to move global value, what was? This is where the story takes an unexpected turn. Because while everyone argues about Bitcoin's future, another system has been developing in near silence. Not as a replacement for money, not as a speculative store of value, but as infrastructure. That's where XRP comes in. XRP wasn't designed to be digital gold. It wasn't built to sit idle in wallets for years. Its entire purpose is movement, fast settlement, deep liquidity, and frictionless value transfer across borders. That distinction changes everything. Instead of asking one asset to do every job, XRP focuses on a single problem the global system still hasn't solved: how to move large amounts of value instantly, cheaply, and reliably between institutions. And it does that in seconds. Transactions don't take minutes. They don't take hours. They don't take days. They settle almost immediately at a cost so small it barely registers. That's not an upgrade to the current system. It's a complete redesign. This is why banks and payment providers don't look at XRP as a currency replacement. They look at it as plumbing, infrastructure, a neutral bridge that lets different systems talk to each other without friction. Once you see XRP through that lens, the conversation changes. It's no longer about hype or price predictions. It becomes about utility. And once utility enters the picture, the math starts to look very different. This is where emotion leaves the conversation and math takes over. There are 100 billion XRP in existence. That number sounds massive at first until you look closer. A large portion of that supply isn't actually moving. Some is locked in escrow, some sits on exchanges, and a significant amount is held long-term by institutions and early believers who rarely sell. What that means is simple. Only a fraction of XRP is truly liquid at any given moment. Now imagine a world where value itself starts to become tokenized. Bonds, stocks, real estate, commodities, even debt. Not replaced, just represented digitally so it can move faster and more efficiently. Out of the hundreds of trillions in global assets, let's assume only a small slice begins moving across digital rails. Say $50 trillion. That's not extreme. That's conservative. If only 10% of XRP is actively circulating while that value flows through the network, each unit suddenly has to carry far more weight. Not because of speculation, because liquidity demands it. At that point, price isn't driven by excitement. It's driven by necessity. The system doesn't care what anyone thinks XRP should be worth. It only responds to how much value needs to move, how fast it needs to settle, and how scarce the available liquidity has become. That's when the numbers start climbing into territory most people dismiss too early. Not because it sounds unbelievable, but because they haven't followed the math all the way through. And this still isn't theoretical, because parts of this system are already being tested in the real world. While most people are still debating theories online, parts of the system are already running quietly in the background. Financial institutions don't move fast, and they don't take risks lightly. They test. They simulate. They pilot systems in controlled environments long before anything becomes public. And that's exactly what's been happening here. Cross-border payment corridors have been set up to move real money between real institutions. Not demos. Not test tokens. Actual value settling in seconds instead of days. That matters because traditional systems are painfully inefficient. Money gets trapped in pre-funded accounts. Fees pile up. Capital sits idle while transactions crawl through layers of intermediaries. Every delay costs institutions time and money. The appeal of instant settlement is obvious. When funds can move on demand, liquidity unlocks. Balance sheets improve. Risk exposure drops, and operational costs shrink dramatically. These aren't abstract benefits, they directly impact profitability. This is why adoption doesn't start with headlines. It starts with internal trials, limited corridors, and quiet integrations. The goal isn't publicity, it's reliability. Once institutions trust a system to move millions without failure, scaling becomes a matter of expansion, not experimentation. And that's the stage this technology is approaching now. But banks aren't the biggest force watching this unfold, because an even larger shift is coming, one that involves governments themselves. This is where the conversation moves beyond banks and into governments. Around the world, central banks are racing to develop digital versions of their national currencies. These aren't cryptocurrencies in the traditional sense. They're digital representations of existing money issued and controlled by governments. But there's a problem almost no one discusses. If every country builds its own digital currency on its own isolated system, nothing actually improves. You just end up with faster silos, different standards, different rails. No universal way for value to move between them. That's where the real challenge begins. Digital currencies still need a bridge. A neutral layer that allows one system to communicate with another instantly, without relying on the same slow intermediaries that exist today. And this is exactly the role XRP was designed to play. Not as a CBDC itself, not as a replacement for national currencies, but as the connective tissue between them. A system like this allows one digital currency to be exchanged for another in seconds, with built-in liquidity and transparent settlement. No waiting. No pre-funded accounts. No multi-day delays. From a government's perspective, that's incredibly powerful. It means faster trade settlement, more efficient capital flows, reduced friction in international payments, and a financial system that actually operates at the speed of the modern world. This is why interest in this technology isn't loud or public-facing. It's strategic. Because once digital currencies go live at scale, the bridge that connects them becomes one of the most important pieces of infrastructure on the planet. And when that bridge starts carrying real volume, everything changes, especially supply. This is the part most people overlook completely. Markets don't move first. Supply does. As institutions begin using an asset for utility instead of speculation, behavior changes. Tokens aren't flipped. They aren't traded daily. They're locked up, reserved, and held for operational use. And when that happens, circulation quietly shrinks. A large share of XRP is already unavailable to the open market. Some is locked by design. Some sits on exchanges. And a growing portion is held by entities that don't need to sell because they're using it for settlement and liquidity. That creates a slow tightening effect. It's the same mechanism seen in traditional markets when major funds accumulate equities and remove them from active trading. Fewer available units. Same or rising demand. Pressure builds without noise. This isn't hype-driven scarcity. It's functional scarcity. Every new corridor, every new institution, every new settlement use case increases demand for liquidity while reducing what's freely available. And here's the key point. If value moving through the system increases faster than supply can re-enter circulation, price doesn't rise because people want it to. It rises because the system requires it. That's why utility-based networks don't explode overnight. They compress. They stabilize. They tighten. And then, when demand reaches a tipping point, repricing happens fast. Which leads to the question everyone keeps asking. If all of this is unfolding, why hasn't the price already moved? This is where impatience usually takes over. When people hear about transformative technology, they expect immediate results. Price spikes, headlines, overnight change. But that's almost never how real infrastructure shifts happen. They move quietly first. Rules need to be written. Systems need to be tested. Partnerships need to be built. And most importantly, trust needs to be earned. None of that happens in public, and none of it moves fast. The early internet followed the same pattern. For years, nothing seemed to work properly. Connections were slow. Applications were unclear. Most people couldn't see the point. Then suddenly, the infrastructure clicked into place, and everything changed at once. That's the phase the system is approaching now. Regulatory pressure is easing. Technical frameworks are maturing. Institutions are no longer experimenting, they're preparing. The groundwork that took years to build is finally aligning. And when infrastructure reaches that point, progress doesn't move gradually. It accelerates. Adoption spreads. Volumes increase. Visibility follows utility instead of speculation. And the market is forced to reprice based on reality rather than anticipation. This is why the absence of explosive movement isn't a warning sign. It's the setup. Because once the switch is flipped, there's no slow version of what comes next. When Trump talked about paying off debt with Bitcoin, most people treated it like a joke or a soundbite. But moments like that matter because they reveal how the conversation is shifting at the highest levels. Governments are no longer asking if digital assets belong in finance. They're asking how. And when you follow that question all the way down to the infrastructure layer, the answer isn't speculation. It's settlement, liquidity, speed, connectivity. That's the real story here. Bitcoin may have opened the door by changing how people think about money. But systems that move value for the world's largest institutions need something different. Something built for flow, not storage. Something designed to connect economies, not compete with them. That's why the most important changes aren't happening on price charts. They're happening in payment corridors, pilot programs, regulatory frameworks, and infrastructure decisions that never make headlines. By the time the public notices, the system is already live. History shows this pattern over and over again. The biggest shifts don't announce themselves. They reveal their impact only after the foundation is complete. And right now, that foundation is nearly finished. The question isn't whether the financial system will move onto digital rails. It's who understood what those rails were built for before everyone else did.